certification. And thanks everyone for coming to this. We're excited to talk to you about certification and covering certification and why you should cover certification. Right now, a lot of the focus is on the period leading up to the election and how voting works. And that makes sense because we're in the period right before a presidential election. We're here to talk about covering certification, which happens after the voting is over, but is really, really important. This used to be kind of a routine part of election administration. It took place mostly behind the scenes after votes were cast and counted. It was boring and sort of arcane, and everyone's, pretty much knew who won at that point, and the public didn't typically pay much attention to it. Like a lot of things about election administration, that changed after the 2020 election. That's when some Republican members of Michigan canvassing boards initially said they weren't going to certify the results or delayed certifying the results, although they ultimately did so. Since then, more than 30 local officials in states around the country have delayed certifying the results of an election or said they wouldn't. There's a lot of concern that efforts like that could trigger a crisis after this year's election. The Georgia State Election Board this summer passed new rules in connection with certification that really supercharged those worries and spurred a lot of coverage. So far, in every case, elections have ultimately been certified. And that's a really important thing that we're going to talk about that matters when you're covering this. In some cases, state officials have used their authority to tell local officials they have to certify. In other cases, state officials have gone to court and obtained court orders telling local officials they have to certify. Election experts have said they're really confident that every state has the legal authority to force members of county election boards to certify results if they have to. That doesn't mean that efforts to delay or stop certification don't do harm, right? Like there's still a problem here that reporters have to cover. There are strict deadlines for certification, so delays matter. Congress passed legislation, the Electoral Count Reform Act in 2022, that cements the timeline by which states have to submit certified slates of electors. This year, that date's December 11th. So that's an important date that states have to hit. And in addition, efforts to delay certification and raise doubts about elections really stoke concerns about the integrity of the election that are often unfounded. So it's important to cover this stuff responsibly and carefully. And it's complicated because every state handles certification a little bit differently, like so many things to do with elections. Since the 2020 election, some states have made legal and process changes to reinforce that certifying is mandatory. It's not discretionary. And it's often referred to as a ministerial act that must be done. We're going to talk about some of the changes in key states and how to learn about and understand your state's certification process and how to cover certification in a really kind of fact-based way, right? And deal with some of the common myths around certification. So what I wanted to do was ask each of the reporters some questions about how they do this. And I wanted to start with Carter by saying, how do you find information on how certification works in your state? How that process has changed in recent years, and how do you take this and make it accessible and clear to people? How do you
Yes,
prepare to report on this?
the number one thing that I do, and I think it's useful for everybody in any state, is you have to start with what the election code says. Each state's election code is a little different, even between Michigan and Arizona and Pennsylvania. I wouldn't pretend to understand what goes on in my colleagues' states just because, yeah, there's a different process set up for every state. So, reading through a bill is cumbersome enough. I found it really useful to find some good election lawyers, particularly ones who were working on elections prior to 2020, because it seemed like a lot of lawyers jumped over into that practice afterwards. And, just have them on speed dial to help me understand how this thing works. Or even better than that is former county officials in PA. It's county commissioners, the executives for the county that do the certifying. So talking with them or election directors on, okay, what are the steps that the county goes through to actually, have a final document that says these are the results from our election. And so I know if they can walk me through that process, then I know where the potential pinch points are and I can focus on that.
Haley, what about you? How do you prepare to do this and explain it to people clearly?
I think for me, I'm for better or for worse, Michigan is one of the few states that doesn't So a lot of states will do elections, they'll run it on a county level. Whereas in Michigan and Wisconsin and a few other states, we run them at the municipal level. Obviously, there are still county elections and there are still county clerks, but I have been very lucky here in Metro Detroit. We have like a true like wealth of knowledge of these like municipal clerks who I can go to with a question and I can say, hi, what I don't, maybe I don't understand this the way I thought I did. Can you explain it to me? Can you walk me through, you know, when you are done and the ballots go away from you, what happens next? And I think something that's been very valuable for me is just building, kind of coming off of what Carter said, really good sources who know what they're talking about. In the most ideal world, there will be nobody who knows more than your local election officials or, you know, lawyers or the people who helped write the law. But if you can find just a few really good people who you can say, you know, I heard this, is this your understanding of this law? You know, is this how this works in your community? Like, how are these people selected? And I think just having sort of a wealth of sourcing here really makes it a lot easier to understand. Obviously, like you can sit and you can read the state law, but it's not always clear. Some of these laws are very arcane, so it's helpful to have like a real person who is doing the work right now to walk you through it.
Jen, what about in Arizona?
I say the best sources on this for me have been people who, really know their community and know where the threat exists. And so getting to know the leaders of the parties in each of the counties, the county parties, getting to know the political makeup of the boards that are going to be certifying, and talking to them about their willingness to do this kind of thing has been helpful in the past. I'm sure we'll get into more of that, but basically on law and law changes, election law, like election lawyers, like Haley said, the people who wrote the laws or were involved in crafting the legislation, the latest legislation that affects your state.
Carter, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think something that Jen said made me think that Jen has 14 counties, I have 67, and Haley has 1,200 municipalities or something like that.
It's 1,500. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
right, 15. So for Jen, she could definitely keep the political makeup of the boards in her head, but for Haley and I, it's a little bit more difficult. So what I mean to say is, I think before you even get to understanding certification, you need to find somebody who can talk you through just a basic uh, overview of how elections in your state work if you don't already know that, and then you can get certification because that's a step that happens after the election takes place.
So when should you do that? Right? I mean, I'm talking to all of you who cover elections as a full-time beat and election administration as a full-time beat. But if you're in this room and you're thinking about covering certification, when do you need to go figure out how that works in your state?
I would say ideally, 6 months ago, but definitely tomorrow if you haven't started doing that already. Because for one, I try not to call election officials on election day, excuse me, at all if I don't have to, because they're pretty busy. So you want to get in touch with them ahead of time.
Jen, Haley?
I mean, I
Same
can,
answer.
yeah, I was about to say, I can
Right.
speak. I'm relatively new to covering this beat. I just started out Votebeat back in, I believe it was July. So like I'm relatively new to this beat and there's definitely a learning curve here, but I think for the best way to do this, honestly, to gain this information is literally just go to Google and type in like board of canvassers state name here, you know, and just see like what do you learn from that. And then there's nothing wrong with just calling those people and being like, hi, can you walk me through what you do? Can you like what do you do? Because a lot of them will be like, yeah, no, this is like kind of an obscure, like they recognize for the most part that their job is, while very, very important, also not something that anybody thinks about in like a normal lifespan.
But more or less, like, you don't want to do this when this is becoming an issue after the election. You want to do this now and figure out how this works in your state, right? And so then the other thing is a lot of states have made changes since 2020 to how certification works and how the law talks about the requirement to certify and the deadlines for certification. So, what I'd love is for each of you to talk about how your state has or hasn't changed the process to address concerns. what types of concerns have come up in your state about certification in the past? And what have your lawmakers or your chief election officials done to address that? And I'm going to start with Jen this time.
I knew you were going to start with me on this one. So we had in 2022, our Cochise County supervisors, Southern Arizona County, refused to certify by the county's deadline. We have a county deadline here that's a week before the state's deadline. And that set off a chain effect under state law on what happens when that happens, which was the Secretary of State's office sued, got a court order to force them to certify. And that all happened before the state's deadline, which ended up making it, allowing the election to proceed as it was supposed to. Now the Secretary of State has changed our state law to say that if a county does not meet their deadline and maybe a court order doesn't work, all the steps are taken to try to force the county to certify, but they won't. The Secretary of State could move forward without their election results. And there are some laws on how this happens across the country that you could look up in your state. I think Carter has one in your state. I'm sure I'll let you talk about that. But where, the Secretary of State or whoever is in control of statewide elections has the ability to move to finalize the results on behalf of other bodies that are typically responsible for it. So that all is still in court here, and we're still trying to figure out how this plays out for this upcoming election.
Haley, Michigan's made a bunch of changes.
Yeah, Michigan. So, sorry, my hair's getting stuck in my eyelash. Okay. Sorry, everybody. So Michigan has made a significant number of changes in the past few years. As Carrie mentioned during kind of our opening session, in Michigan, we had some spice back in 2020 when initially some of the Republican canvassers, so for context, in Michigan, every board of canvassers is 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The Wayne County Republican canvassers had initially said they weren't going to certify. For context, Wayne County is where Detroit is. They said they weren't going to certify. We have later learned that they were allegedly pressured by former President Trump, well, then President Trump, right, because there was all these rumors circulating of like Detroit's elections weren't properly handled, and then we separately had a single state Republican canvasser say, I don't know about this, and then we had the other Republicans step in and say, we have an obligation here. And so to avoid that ever happening again, what Michigan has done is we've enacted quite a few laws that effectively just clarify that it's not optional to certify the election in Michigan. I would argue that in Michigan, we probably have one of the clearest laws, if not the clearest law in the state, that explicitly lays out that a county canvasser must certify the election. They do not have a choice in it. If they are choosing not to certify because of some outside factor, they believe there was fraud, they believe, non-citizens were voting, they believe that doesn't matter. You have to certify based on what is in front of you. This is very clear in state law. If you choose not to, that's not good, right? But what will happen instead is the state board of canvassers will then take your results. You basically are forced to hand them over. They will take them, they will certify, and then your county will have to pay for the immense cost of a state level canvass, which is much more expensive than a county level one. But what we have learned is that there is an understanding of the law as it's written that cost for that state level canvas can be passed directly on to the canvasser who refuses to certify. And you have to keep in mind, this is the tunes of like tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost here. And also we have in place here an understanding between the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State's office, where if you do not certify, you are facing criminal charges for this. It is extremely clear in Michigan, and we have done this time and time again, kind of preemptively to make clear that you don't have this choice. The ACLU went after a canvasser in Kalamazoo County on the west side of the state, basically saying, you have suggested to a newspaper that you wouldn't certify. That's not acceptable. Like, they took him to court and got a signed affidavit from him effectively saying, like, I will follow state law. Like, they are not playing here. They are over and over again, they are not playing. Which has just made a very interesting point here in Michigan where they say, okay, it was embarrassing last time. And so our lawmakers and our attorney general and our secretary of state have said, we are not dealing with this again. We are not talking about election fraud in Michigan. We are not talking about not certifying. We are going to handle our stuff, which has been, it's very forceful, the amount of legislation that is now behind this, because they said, oh, we are not ever doing this again.
Carter, what about Pennsylvania? You've had some issues around certification in Pennsylvania. Talk to me about how they're planning to handle that going into the 24 election and what steps the state's taken.
Yeah, well, Pennsylvania is a bit of an odd man out. We suffer from chronic gridlock, so we haven't really made any changes to our certification process, but it still has been a problem here. After the midterm primary, there were some counties, 3 counties. We have an ongoing debate about whether or not mail ballots need to have their envelope, need to have a handwritten signature on the envelope for them to be counted. Some counties didn't agree with the most recent, at that time, court decision on it and decided not to include those ballots in their certified results. And what ended up happening was the state's, chief election authority, the Department of State, took them to court and got a court order that said, okay, the counties have to certify. Unlike in Michigan, our chief election authority, the Department of State, the Secretary of State, can't just take over that responsibility. They have to get a court order forcing the county to do it. So that takes a little bit longer. And then we had later that year, after the November election, there was a situation very easy for 3 citizens in Pennsylvania to ask to have their specific voting district do a recount. And if a county is facing one of those recounts, the county doesn't have to certify the race under law. So that could lead to delays. And I know we're going to get into the Electoral Count Reform Act, but now with this year, there's a lot of concern about those 2 things because both of those incidents held up the certification for a number of weeks that would blow past this new deadline. So, like I said, the state, we haven't made any legal changes. The Department of State has very limited authority, but everyone is very cognizant of this possibility. The Department of State, they got their finger on the trigger with lawsuits ready to go should any county refuse to certify. And it's fairly obvious which counties those would be if there is. So they're prepared to face those challenges if they need to. And one of the more positive signs recently, since, as I explained, a lot of this is going to fall on the courts, is that the courts have shown that they are not going to drag things out and take a long time to answer questions like they have in the past. They understand that there's existential deadlines the state has to meet, and so between those 2 things, we'll probably be able to resolve them.
I'm going to start with Haley on this one. So very often when there's drama around certification, and I know you're newer to the beat, it's because people are raising questions about whether the election was free and fair, right? Was properly conducted, whether there was some sort of fraud or something that should taint the results. How do you responsibly cover questions people are raising while also pointing out the safeguards around certification? How do you sort of strike a balance of explaining what's being raised, of covering it responsibly, of reporting it with context, and explaining the safeguards around certification that exist to make sure the process goes forward?
This is a really great question, actually. I think the easiest way that I have found as someone who is relatively new to this beat is I have formed like a really deep understanding of what election law actually is and what is required of clerks as they are processing ballots. In Michigan, we're very lucky that, all things considered, like, as ballots are being processed, we have a lot of options for people to come watch them. They can be a poll challenger, they can be a poll watcher, they can be a poll worker if they want to. There's a lot of options for people to get really involved in this process. And this is kind of where it comes back to what I said earlier of I despite it can sometimes be a bit of a pain to have to cover, 1,500 different municipalities all running elections, right? Fortunately, in Michigan, this is not true in all states, but in Michigan, we only have county and state level certification processes. But I think if you have a good understanding going into the election of like, it's not actually possible for a person to vote twice because, and this is something that we've been actually talking a lot about here in Michigan, because the Attorney General just in fact charged 4 voters with felonies for allegedly voting twice in the August primary, because when you vote once in Michigan, okay, it flags in the electronic poll book. So say you send your absentee ballot in, right? You cannot vote a second time. And this is something that I can say with great authority, because the fact that they were able to vote a second time is a huge deal, because it means that the processes were violated. It means that if this is true, this means that somebody was doing something fundamentally wrong during the election process, against training, against everything. We know this is extremely rare because these safeguards are in place. So I think if you have a good understanding of what your safeguards are, when someone comes at you with what might be I think the thing about these kind of like conspiracy theories, if that's what you want to call them, is they all sound plausible, the good ones. Trust me, we've all heard some bad ones too, but they'll sound plausible enough that you'll be like, is that true? Is that possible? And if you come at this with a fundamental knowledge of like, no, all things considered, that should not be possible in my state, in my community, it's much easier for you to ask smart questions of sources as you're coming to them and saying like, I'm hearing this is happening. Can you explain to me how that's possible? And then a lot of times you guys can have a very level conversation of like, in fact, that's not, and here's how I can demonstrate to you that that's not. You can, for the most part, you can trust that your election officials also want everyone to understand that their election is free and fair and safe and secure, and they're willing to demonstrate that to you within the confines of state law. And so I think when we talk about fraud in terms of certification, fraud, as people like to talk about it, is not happening, right? In a national election where, hundreds of millions of people are voting, yes, there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be things that happen in like small doses, but overwhelmingly the fraud that people talk about is not happening. It's just not a thing. And you can know that if you understand how elections are run in your community.
Jen?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. To expand on it a little bit, like how do you figure that out, right? Especially when you're time crunched. We are lucky to only cover one topic, but most reporters do not cover one topic. And so, I mean, I would recommend, like, for example, I am currently at the machine testing for Maricopa County's election. And this is a place, I'm sure your states are also doing some sort of testing, pre-election testing, where you can go and have access to just one county or one jurisdiction's example of how they're preparing for the election, and take 30 minutes and ask all the questions you can about how it works, the safeguards in place for our big thing. And why I'm here is there's been a lot of challenges to the certification of machines, the accreditation of the labs that test them, and the way that they work. So trying to understand just topical things as fast as you can to know how to respond to claims when they come up.
Carter?
Yeah, I think Haley had the answer. I remember a time before I was with Votebeat, and this is why I think it's really important to have that information ahead of time when your if your county commissioner or town clerk or whatever is gonna not certify, you have to press them on the specifics. Maybe even if you don't understand it, it's good to press them on the specifics and get them on the record as to why. I remember in 2020, there was a press conference ahead of the election, district attorney and the county commissioner saying, you know, we're not going to let fraud happen here. We're going to prosecute it. Don't even try it. And I knew I've been covering county government for a long time, so I made a point to ask the commissioner at the press conference, Commissioner, you're aware that there's never been any fraud in Lancaster County, correct? And so got him to admit it and put it on the record ahead of time. And so I guess that's what I would emphasize. Like if you see that your county is going to make a decision to not certify, even if you don't understand the specifics in the moment, make sure you get as much detail from them and press them on exactly why they're going to do that, so that you or others could fact check it later.
Someone once described certification to me as like, an assembly line, right? It's sort of an endpoint of an assembly line when people have been putting something together. So you've had the election workers kind of outrunning an election, collecting, all the information they're supposed to collect, and making sure the safeguards are in place, and making sure that the only people who vote are entitled to vote. And when they pass those tallies to the people who are supposed to certify the election, it's sort of like the people at the end of the car assembly line who are saying, okay, there's an engine in here and there's a rear view mirror on this thing and we can send it out, but they're not necessarily taking that engine apart, right? They're making sure it's there, but they're not taking it apart. And so, and I wish I remember who was sort of explaining it to me that way, because it was a great explanation. Certification is doing a specific thing. It's not supposed to be about reopening every decision that's been made about the election process. And often what certifying does is it starts the clock, and every state again is a little different, on the period when people can ask for recounts or can challenge the way an election was conducted in court, right? They can sue. And so it starts that period once an election is certified, but certification itself is not really designed to do that. And so I thought, to me, that was a really helpful explanation. But one of the things I wanted to ask you all, and was kind of leading up to, is what are some of the myths about certification you hear over and over again? Because it is an obscure process, right? It is a poorly understood process. And what are the things people believe about it that really aren't quite right? Carter?
Yeah, I think even for me, this is confusing, and I'm not sure on the specifics, like I said, of how it works in other states, but I imagine, I think in Michigan, if I recall from the news coverage in 2020, like this was the issue too. Like in PA, it's not an optional thing the way it's written under law. You just have to do it. But that being said, it requires the election officials, the county commissioners who are elected, they're politicians. It requires them to physically sign a document, right? So on the one hand, the law says it's not optional, but on the other hand, like they have to take there's some agency that they have overdoing it. So I just think, I find that to be very confusing, and I think that can be confusing for readers. And honestly, I've seen people on boards of elections, commissioners get confused when their solicitor is telling them, no, you don't have an option in this thing. Physically, you have to put your hand on that piece of paper. So yeah, I think that can be troubling.
Jen?
I think what Carter said, I mean, I think it's the nuance of how the state law works and what the requirements are, and if it is discretionary, or what are the areas in the state law that can be manipulated in order to try to say that the law is different than it is. And that's kind of hard to say generally for all states, but specifically talking to a few election lawyers from either side to say, what are the challenges that could take place over the way the law is written could clear up some of the myths and some of the claims that come up about the actual law.
Haley?
I think here, obviously, yeah, there is the misunderstanding that it is optional because, yes, Carter makes a great point. Like you do, in fact, like there is some level of autonomy involved in signing your name on these, or like voting in Michigan is how you move it through, is voting to approve. Like there is a level of autonomy in there, but you have to consider it's the same level of autonomy you have like when you get into a car. You are if you're a licensed driver, there is still an understanding that you're not going to hit somebody with your car, right? Like it's still the law that you're not allowed to do that, even though you do have free, like you can, but you will face legal consequences about this. I think also that one other thing that comes up in Michigan a lot is because we do have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on every board of canvassers. And there's 83 counties in Michigan, and then there obviously is the state board of canvassers as well. Like these are members of your community who are certifying these elections, right? And you might not know them personally, particularly if you live in a big community, right? But these are people who have, in taking this job, agreed to uphold these laws, right? And you have to keep in mind that, and I believe this is true in every state, but the understanding in Michigan is that if you do not certify the election, and why the ACLU got involved in this, et cetera, is that you are disenfranchising. If you are the canvasser, you are disenfranchising every voter who voted in the election that you are supposed to be certifying. So this is like the level of severity you have to approach this with. If you are not certifying the election, you are telling every voter, let's say you believe that there was 500 fake ballots, you are telling the other million voters or however many in your jurisdiction that their votes are not important because there might be 500 fake ones or whatever. Like that is the severity you have to look at this is if an election is not certified and those votes are not counted, those votes are not counted, right? That is the definition of disenfranchisement is taking away somebody's right to vote. And that is the level of severity we see it in Michigan. And I think that's the level of severity that you need to approach this if this is a conversation you're having in your own state of like, well, is this county going to certify? Is the state going to do that? Like if it doesn't happen and those votes aren't counted in the final slates, which is in most states is not even an option, right? That is every single one of those voters who voted in that jurisdiction was basically told that your vote is nothing and it does not matter. Like you have to treat this with it's the most boring thing that you hope you never have to think about, but when you do have to think about it, it is a very big deal.
And I think, Haley, I liked your example of when you get a driver's license, you're essentially entering into the social contract where like you can hit someone with your car, but if you do, you're breaking the law and there will be legal consequences for that. And I think that's where some of the confusion over discretion here comes in. If you have to vote, if you have to sign your name, then don't you have some agency here? And the answer is, and I think this has come up a lot with the changes in the Georgia rules set by the state election board there. The law in Georgia says that these officials have to certify. So these rules don't change that law, right? Like the way an expert put it to me was there is no magic loophole that makes the law something else and allows people to arbitrarily exclude valid ballots cast by eligible voters. Like if you're looking for a loophole that just lets people exclude valid ballots cast by eligible voters, the law doesn't allow it. Like, and whatever anyone says about discretion or questions about the election, the law doesn't let them do it. And if you do it, you're breaking the law. And so that's a really important distinction that I think you're making, especially since I live in DC and there are a lot of really bad drivers here. Like truly a lot of really bad, like just because you can run the red light doesn't mean you're allowed to, and doesn't mean there aren't going to be consequences for running the red light. And so that kind of nicely tees up my next question, Hallie. And I'm going to start with Jen on this one because I think there's been some interesting things there. What have been the consequences for delaying certification? What sort of accountability steps have been taken when people have done this?
So as I mentioned
too.
So as I mentioned in Cochise County, there was a challenge to the certification where 2 Republican members of their 3-member board refused to certify by the deadline. The certification still happened on time, but the Attorney General, when she took office the next year, decided to pursue an investigation, which led to a grand jury indictment of the 2 supervisors, which is currently still pending in court. The trial is in January, accusing them of conspiracy and interference with an election officer. There are laws that are a little bit less election laws and just punishment for breaking laws in the state that apply here. But specifically here, if you interfere with the work of a election officer, in this case, it was the secretary's duty to certify, then you were breaking the law in a way that you could be personally held liable, not just your county. And so there's consequences personally for the supervisors to choose to take these actions and for the actual county themselves.
And Jen, to be clear, they're looking at some jail time for this. If they're convicted of this, there's actual criminal.
Perhaps, yeah, because it's two felony charges that they're facing.
So, and that's something that you're covering on an ongoing basis as this works its way through the system.
Yeah, I would say, if this does happen in a county, you do have to just kind of try to figure out the claims behind what happened exactly. It might be that you're coming in after the fact and trying to figure out what the heck happened here and rewatching meetings and all of that, like I did over and over again to try to figure out what led to it. I mean, that's an important question of public matter, what causes people to do the things that they do. So.
Haley, I think you've already talked about the Kalamazoo example, and the consequence was he got sued, right?
Yeah, so in the state of Michigan, I kind of touched on this earlier. The ACLU lawsuit was a civil lawsuit, but I want to make clear that the Attorney General, who for context is a Democrat, our Secretary of State is also a Democrat, they have made extremely, extremely clear time and time again that this is not optional. You know, that it's the same thing we're seeing over and over again. Like Michigan elections are not up for play is basically what our Attorney General has demonstrated to us. I mean, back in May, there was a recall election up in Delta County, which is in the northern part of the state. It's in the Upper Peninsula, I believe. It is. That's where it is. But the Board of Canvassers in the county initially refused to certify that election. And they basically had to get, I'm not going to say bullied into it by the state government, basically being like, this is not optional. You do have to certify this. But like, it was the Secretary of State's office coming down and saying, this is not an optional thing. It was the Attorney General's office saying, I will charge you with a misdemeanor, you know. And it's considered the exact law is basically like willful neglect of duty is what the law is here. So if you don't certify, it is a misdemeanor, it is immense fines, and it opens you up for civil litigation, which I think in the ACLU case out of Kalamazoo, I think that one resolved about as positively as it could have, because the guy pretty much immediately was like, I'll sign the paper, I will sign the paper, please don't sue me on this, right? That resolved pretty much as smoothly as I could have. But if someone opted still again, what I have to imagine against the advice of the attorney, you know, if they still opted not to do that, that is opening them up to immense personal litigation against them, which will likely be very expensive. And also, like, generally speaking, and I can say this in Michigan, but it's also true in most courts, like, we've really established at this point, like, what the right to vote looks like. And just straight up not counting somebody's ballots is in direct violation of that. So yeah, the short answer to the question is it's a misdemeanor and probably big fines. The long answer is, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. That's really not an option. It's so expensive for you personally.
Carter? And then I think we're going to start taking questions too. So please get your best questions ready.
Yeah, well, Pennsylvania, there really haven't been any consequences for not certifying the election. The three counties that did it in November of 20 or May of 2022, yeah, there's no consequences for them. I think most, if not all of the folks on those boards who ran for reelection were reelected. There are consequences occasionally for other things in Pennsylvania, like if you invite crazy people to come open up your election machines without, the proper security clearances, you can be fined millions of dollars for doing that. But yeah, for not certifying, unlike other states, no consequences here.
So maybe everyone's too worried about Georgia and they should be more worried about Pennsylvania.
Maybe, yeah, or at least a few counties.
All right, we've been talking for a while now, and I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. I think Beatrice, you were gonna round those up, and we are happy to try and answer them.
So far, we only have one question that was dropped in the chat, and that's from Kimmy Way, who asked if reporters are allowed to visit election processing centers on election day to see how ballot processing is being handled.
I can take that. Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on your state and even your wherever it is you're trying to go. In Pennsylvania, it's not legally mandated that it's open to the public. It's open to political parties and candidates. But if you have a good relationship with the county or the county election director, they might let you come.
Does anybody else want to augment that answer?
In Arizona, it's very common to have a public space to watch ballot counting happen in the election headquarters, and that public space, if you're not invited specially, you could go as a reporter at any time to see that. It also has to be like live streamed on cameras here, so even if you don't want to drive to that county, you can look up the county website to see if you have that live stream option available. And then, like Carter said, if there's special times at which reporters will have access, sometimes that happens too. So you just kind of had to watch out for those special opportunities.
In Michigan, I can say we have, as part of the spectacle that was created in 2020, if we can all recall the like photos of like the banging on the windows at TCF Center, which is where Detroit's votes were being counted. We have changed laws in Michigan to effectively say like, yes, the public can be here, but it has to be like under the permission of the clerk. It has to be under like, so it's worth talking to, like, I know I just in this August primary, I had a really wonderful time basically following a clerk around, and I was allowed in because he said I could be in there, right? And that's probably true in most jurisdictions where like if the clerk gives you an okay, it's okay. Like the clerk's not going to let you like violate the sanctity of their election because that's bad for them as well. So for the most part, you have to check your specific state laws, but honestly, the best person to talk to about that is the clerk, or whom, if you have a director of elections or whomever is running your election, is the best person to say like, hi, can I come in? Can I just look at this? Can I document this process to share with the public?
All right. Haley, there's a specific follow-up question for you in the chat from Kimmy if you want to answer it. Um,
This is, yes, I can answer this. For me specifically in August, I was following a municipal clerk because again, I'm in Michigan where we have local clerks run their elections and then county clerks assist, but effectively aren't running the election on the day-to-day necessarily, except for county-wide elections. They basically just take the ballots in and process the numbers that are given to them by the local communities. But yeah, I basically called a clerk who has become a really, truly wonderful source to me in this. And was like, hi, can I follow you around? And he was like, yeah, you can. And it was a wonderful, very strange experience. One thing I learned from that is that clerks are the weirdest people on earth. He would like drive with an open coffee mug, like not like one of those like travel tumblers, but just like an open mug. It stressed me out really badly. That's not relevant to this, but I just need you to know who you're dealing with when you're talking to your clerks. They're strange people.
well, I think that's a good point about like humanizing the people who do this sort of stuff because these are community members. And I think we often forget that because you either don't see them ever or think about them, or they become part of that like amorphous soup of like local officials, right? And what does that mean to people? Now we're starting to get the chat active. Katie Green's dad does that and it's very stressful. Alexa Urbach asked, for those of us new to election coverage, what are some examples of preview stories that you have found important to showcase leading up to election day regarding certification and especially in battleground states? I'm going to plop one in the chat because I have some examples from you guys, but feel free to shout out some story ideas.
Anyone want to kick this off? When it comes to certification, I think if you're in a state that isn't having ongoing litigation over some of these rules, it's still a good idea to write a preview story saying, hey, this is how this works here. There have been questions about this around the country. This is how this works. This is what our law says. This is what people have to do. But I'm going to let the others jump in and answer that question.
I would add to that and say, yes, that's it, but also timeline. And that's something that I saw a question come up on when this will happen and what to expect on the timing of it. And, if, it all goes back to like how fast results are counted too, that allows, then allows the results to be certified. So backing it up and saying like, we're not going to have final and certified results until 20 days after the election in Arizona because of these steps that have to take place with our counting. So that's the only thing.
Yeah, I would say, building off what Jen's saying, anything you can do just around what those steps are, like anything explainer, because people really don't understand. Even me, when I became an election reporter and I had covered county government, which includes covering how elections run, like people still think of just elections as okay, you walk into the poll and cast your ballot. People don't understand like what happens to get from there to what's on the website at the end of the night where you can see the results. Or anything you can do to explain, okay, well, the person running that polling place takes the ballots back to this location and they upload the information onto this one computer and then onto another computer. And then after that, they do this audit. Like anything you can do that explains the process that goes on that 99% of people aren't going to see is good.
I'll add one thing to that, which is it's also a good chance to remind people that the numbers they do see on election night, even if they are enough to have people calling a race, are unofficial results. And the reason they're unofficial results is there's still a lot going on, right? Some states, will accept mail ballots up to a few days after election day, as long as they're postmarked on time. And there's military and overseas ballots that are still getting processed, and provisional ballots when there was a question about someone's eligibility and they have a certain number of days to resolve those questions and decide whether they'll be counting that ballot. So there's still things going on that mean that the results are still changing somewhat as those things happen. And so talking about what happens after you cast your ballot at a polling place on election day, if that's how you cast it, is kind of important because it lets you have some transparency through the whole system. Anyone have anything to add to that? Any more questions coming in?
Yes, we have one from Chad. Chad is asking, what are the time frames for boards to complete their certifications after the election in various states? And just in general, how fast can we expect all of this to happen?
Well, Carrie, I don't think we ever actually explained the Electoral Count Reform Act much, so maybe we could talk about that because that'll apply to every state.
Right, that's true. I think I said at the beginning that there's a deadline for states to get their certificates of electors and everything to Congress, but I don't think we went into it. Carter, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so at the end of 2022, in reaction to what happened in 2021 on January 6th, and the challenges to certification there, the U.S. Congress updated the way that our votes get tallied from the states into one national certified vote. And part of that was before this law went into effect in 2022, there was like an idea of a safe harbor date is what it's called, of when the states had to have their certifications completed by in order for that information to get to Congress for it to do its job on January 6th. But that wasn't really like a hard and fast deadline. So the Electoral Count Reform Act did make that a hard and fast deadline, which is 6 days before the Electoral College meets to vote, I'm sure you all know what the Electoral College is, the folks who we vote for that actually vote for the president. And so this year, since the college is meeting on December 17th, that date is December 11th. So the Secretary of State in your state is going to have to, or whomever is going to have to certify the election by December 11th, which means if local municipalities or county has to certify first before the secretary certifies, they got to get it done sometime before that. For me, it's 3 weeks after the election, so sometime around Thanksgiving, and that's probably a good time frame in most states. It's probably going to be around that Thanksgiving to early December window.
I did look into the timeline generally for multiple states as we looked at our election timeline earlier this year and found that it varies widely. Some states you certify within 5 days and you're done. And these are most likely states that don't have a lot of mail voting and a lot of rules for curing problems with ballots. And so those states could be done within 5 days. Here it's a weeks long process. I know California doesn't finish counting votes for 3 weeks, period. So their process is I think it's about a month after the election where they certify. And so I think becoming familiar with that timeline is important in your state.
I will say in Michigan, and I can drop this in the chat. We basically, the Secretary of State basically puts out a deadline, and this is designed for clerks basically, but it's available to anyone. Our specific deadline is you must have canvassed by November 25th, which I believe is the Monday before Thanksgiving, if I remember what day Thanksgiving is this year. But it's based on within, I believe, 3 weeks of the election is what that is considered to be. So it's different for every state. Just it's very easy to look up your own date, though. It will be in state law.
Any more questions?
We have another question from my coworker, Debbie Lockwood. Are there questions that you wish reporters in other states, especially swing states, would ask folks who work elections on or after election day? The Inquirer's been in touch with many poll workers in Bucks County for a pre-election story, but we want to make sure we're getting a more unique angle.
I love asking the question, what keeps you up at night? What are you most worried about? Because I think that hits on some underreported stories that the people who know the process best could speak to.
Haley?
I just really like to broadly ask people, like, how are you? And you got to say it with like the right tone to like really nail that, you know, they're going through a lot, but also like that they're working really hard and they're going to get through it. You got to really do it well. But I know that sounds like a joke of like, haha, of course you'd ask your no, but like actually like look them in the eyes and be like, how are you doing? Like, are you well? Because that is how I have in the past gotten stories of like, yeah, someone threatened to kill my cat the other day, and you're like, what do you mean? Or they'll be like, actually, this is the easiest election I've ever had, and this is why. And so, like, if you like genuine, and this just kind of comes back to the good source building thing of like, if you treat your sources like people, they will tell you things that are happening to them, both good and bad.
And Carter, especially since this is a Pennsylvania question.
Yeah, I think I would ask them what, like, if you guys are from the Inquirer, so you're not from another state, but if you're a reporter out of state, you need to ask them, or even in state, because I do ask the people this, like, what are other reporters or just people that don't think about elections every day, like you and I, getting wrong about how elections in X place works. And you can get good stories that way. Like a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times and NPR and everybody else under the national sun were writing that early voting started in Pennsylvania on September 16th, which I'm sure you guys know at the Inquirer is not the case. And so, real easy story for me to write, knowing that my sources in the election administration world were worried about that misinformation. I could just easily correct it with their help and from memory. And that's something that, like, not even possible. It did happen that national reporters are missing that story because they're not in touch with the people that have that knowledge of how things work at the local level.
I like all of those questions. Sometimes I ask too, what's changed for you? Right? Especially when I'm talking to people who have worked multiple elections, like what's different about this one? And sometimes I also say, like, what stories do you wish people were writing? Sometimes you don't get a very good answer to that. You just get, that we're doing a great job, right? Like, but sometimes you do get a really interesting answer to that.
I also think in this climate, it's very easy to focus like the negative of the work these people do, to ask them what is your most favorite part of your job? What keeps you coming back? I know in my reporting in Pennsylvania, a lot of poll workers and election administrators, it runs in the family. So to get at that thread of like, what called you to do this, is also helpful.
I also
We
think
have, yes,
I was just gonna add
mentioned in
one
the
thing.
chat, who else should
Yeah.
I be talking to is a great one and an oldie.
I was just gonna say it's also good to keep an eye on whether there are enough people working the elections and who they are. I did a story before the 2020 election that still remains one of my favorite stories about the average age of poll workers, because there's actually data on this. The USEAC tracks this for a lot of states, and a lot of poll workers are elderly, and there was a pandemic, and a lot of them insisted they were still going to work because it was really important to have poll workers and nobody else was going to do it. And I just remember talking to an election official in Maine who had a 90-something-year-old woman insisting she was going to work the election and who was absolutely beside herself because she didn't really want her to do it, but she also didn't really have anybody else. So I think that kind of thing, who are our election workers? What can I find out about them? What are some interesting things about them can produce some really interesting stories.
I wrote a story in a similar vein in 2020. Idaho. I was in Idaho at the time, and Idaho is a very libertarian state. And they were basically, and you can check this in your own state, because a lot of states did change like what the requirement was. Idaho basically, if I remember correctly, either doesn't have a law or granted a temporary permission. So like if you were either 14 or 16 or older, you could work the election, and they were like giving students like school credit for like there was high schoolers working the election because they had the day off school, and they were like, we'll pay you, the $200 or whatever, which when you are 16 years old is a lot of freaking money. The worst part of adulthood is learning that that's not a lot of freaking money. But that's a great way to look at this too, is like, what kind of 17-year-old is like, I will spend my day off school helping people vote and they will be angry at me, but it will be fine. You know what I mean? It's a customer service job. So it's like people have very fun stories about people who they've helped vote.
People get creative about recruiting. The clerk in Madison, Wisconsin also licensed all the bartenders, like tracked all the bartender licensing. And because this is a customer service job, she rounded up all the bartending, like all the bartenders. She used her registration records and recruited all the bartenders to come be election workers. It was like a really good idea because they're very good at dealing with difficult people.
My coworker Debbie said that one question that she's enjoyed asking is what folks plan to do with the $200, which has ranged meaning of fancy hats going out for Mexican food to like bike jerseys. I know in Philly some people might try to spend it on cheap Eagles tickets. That's also a silly angle. We are unfortunately, or if you're on deadline, fortunately, right at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us for such an informative webinar and panel. As a thank you, later this week, you will receive the recording as well as a lovely little guide on how to get started on the election certification beat that our friends at Votebeat went and gathered for you all. So thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your day.